The hot sun hung over the neighborhood like an all-seeing eye, illuminating every detail of the summer day. The air was saturated with the thick aroma of fried meat mixed with the spicy smells of pickles and freshly cut grass. The sound of laughter, conversations, and the rustling of plastic plates gave the illusion of serenity. People were smiling, children were running around the grills, and music from an old radio added a pleasant background to this family idyll. But there was something missing in this picture. Something was wrong. Someone looking at the crowd might have noticed a few adults furtively glancing over their shoulders, as if they were waiting for something unpleasant to happen. Anxiety hid in the corners of their eyes, in the brief pauses between smiles. Here, in this seemingly friendly gathering, there was a tension that not everyone noticed. In the middle of the clearing, not far from the big table, sat Jaden, a skinny teenager with crutches that looked too heavy for his age. His right leg was fixed in a bulky cast, but that didn't stop him from laughing with his friends. His smile was wide, almost infectious, and he seemed to enjoy every moment of the day. His friends made jokes about his awkward movements, and Jaden returned the jokes, his presence seeming to dispel the shadows that crept around him. Still, his father, a tall man with a graying beard and a sharp gaze, stood to the side scrutinizing the crowd like a hawk. He never relaxed, especially here in this neighborhood that knew what injustice looked like. He could feel it like old soldiers feel the change in the wind before a battle. Jaden looked up and met his father's gaze. The man nodded at him, trying to smile, but something troubling flashed in his eyes. Jaden looked away, feeling a slight twinge of unease. He hadn't realized that his father had sensed danger long before it came. And then there was a sound, short, sharp, as if someone had stepped on a dry branch. A uniformed man appeared at the edge of the clearing, a policeman. His heavy gaze slid over the crowd, lingered on Jaden, and then reluctantly continued on. He didn't seem to fit in. His presence was too cold, too heavy. The people were silent, as if the air were thicker and the heat of the sun was no longer warm. But Jaden didn't notice it right away. He was still laughing at his friend's joke when the invisible threat behind him began to move. He appeared like a predator coming out of hiding to see if he had missed his prey. Tall, with a square jaw and a hard expression, Officer Dalton moved with the heavy-set confidence that power and weapons give. His uniform was ironed to a shine, the leather belt of his gear gleamed in the sun, and a mask of contempt froze on his face. Dalton didn't smile. Never. He was the embodiment of the same coldness that suddenly gripped the men at the barbecue. His eyes, two ice flakes shining beneath the visor of his cap, glided carefully through the crowd. He saw the faces, the smiles, the laughter, the friendly hugs. It all made him cringe. Too many black people, too much happiness that he didn't think they deserved. He liked to think of himself as the master of these neighborhoods, and every time he came here, he reminded everyone that they were always under his supervision. Dalton stopped a few meters away from the meeting and began to slowly circle the grounds like a shark circling its target. He didn't need to say anything to build tension. His presence was louder than words. A woman with 2 children hurriedly took them aside, casting a brief, startled glance at the policeman. Dalton noted her movement with satisfaction. People were afraid of him, and he enjoyed it. His attention was drawn to Jaden. The teenager was laughing, sitting in a folding chair, his crutches lying on the ground nearby. The laughter annoyed Dalton. Too loud, too carefree. He couldn't explain why it hurt him, but a wave of anger surged in his chest. Something about this boy. His broken leg, his lightness, his smile seemed like a challenge. "Hey, you," Dalton said sharply, heading toward Jaden. His voice was like a whiplash, silencing the conversation. Everyone turned, watching his every move. Jaden looked up, surprised, but not immediately realizing that the words were addressed to him. "Yes, you. What are you sprawled out here like a king?" Dalton added, crossing his arms over his chest and staring at Jaden with cold contempt. The teen blinked, stunned by the rough tone. "Yeah, I'm just sitting here," he mumbled, trying to figure out what he'd done wrong. "Sitting up, huh? What's wrong with your leg? Or are you just faking it so you don't have to work like the others?" The cop took a step closer, and his shadow fell over Jaden, as if he were trying to overwhelm him with his presence. "It's an injury, sir," Jaden replied, trying to remain calm. He could feel the man's gaze burning through him, and his hands began to tremble. Dalton grinned, but there was no warmth in his grin. "An injury? Huh. I thought people like you were used to shirking work." His words were drenched in venom, which the crowd instantly sensed. Whispers ran through the gathered crowd, but no one dared to intervene. "Hey, why don't you step away from my son?" A voice came from behind me. It was Jaden's father. His tone was calm, but his eyes blazed with anger. He took a step forward, stepping between the cop and the teenager. Dalton squinted his eyes. "Your son, huh? That's what it is. I wondered who put him on a pedestal around here. You must be proud that he's already learned to be lazy, huh?" "That's enough," Dad said calmly, though every muscle in his body tensed. "This is a family barbecue. You're not here to attack my child." But Dalton wasn't going to leave. His fingers lightly touched the baton on his belt, as if he were pondering whether to use it. "Your child? Then maybe you can explain to him that people like him shouldn't draw attention to themselves, especially in front of the law." The policeman's words fell like stones in the silence, echoing in the minds of the crowd. The crowd froze in tension, like a taut string ready to break at any moment. Before we go any further, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories. Have there been similar situations in your life or in the lives of people you know? It's important to know how these stories resonate with you. And, of course, if you want to not miss out on exciting new stories, be sure to subscribe. And now we continue. Dalton took another step forward, his massive figure hovering over Jaden as if he wanted to crush the boy with his mere presence. The crowd around him froze, no one moving, only the occasional whisper breaking the tense silence. Every eye was fixed on the scene, as if they were afraid to blink, lest they miss the moment when it all came crashing down. "So, hero, why are you so quiet?" Dalton grinned, leaning closer to Jaden. His voice was both mocking and threatening. "Just laughing, and now you're tongue-tied?" "Yeah, I don't understand what you want, sir." Jaden tried to speak calmly, but his voice trembled. He felt like the ground beneath him was swaying, and there were no crutches to lean on. They were lying on the ground where Dalton had just swept them with his boot, as if they were trash. "You don't get it," the policeman repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I'll explain it to you. You're sitting there, sprawled out like someone owes you a favor. What if you just got up and did something useful? Though that's probably too complicated for someone like you." "I'm injured. My leg is broken." Jaden forced out the words, staring at the ground so he wouldn't have to look at Dalton. He wanted to disappear, to not see those cold, contemptuous eyes. "Injured?" "Injured," Dalton said loudly so that everyone could hear. "That's the way it always is. You always have some reason for doing nothing. It's the same thing every time. Broke my leg? So what? I know guys with injuries like that who work their asses off. You're just sitting there like a little prince, aren't you?" The crowd around them began to move. Someone took a step forward, but stopped immediately, meeting the intense gaze of Jaden's father. His father was as still as a rock, but there was anger in his eyes. He stared at Dalton as if he were studying his every move, every word, preparing for the inevitable. "Sir, I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Jaden said quietly, looking down. He could feel his face burning with humiliation. Every time the policeman said, "People like you," those words cut his soul like a knife. It hurt him not only physically, but mentally as well. Dalton hummed, his grin growing even wider. "You didn't mean any offense? Or maybe you want to apologize for being here at all. Look at what you look like. Where's your pride? Oh, I forgot. People like you have nothing to be proud of." The words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Jaden felt his eyes fill with tears. He didn't want to cry, not in front of this man, but he couldn't hold back the emotion. He felt helpless, like a cornered animal. "You have no right to say that," a voice said suddenly. It was Jaden's mother. Her words were quiet, but there was such determination in them that even Dalton stopped for a moment. She took a step forward, her eyes full of tears, but her voice didn't waver. "He's a child. You have no right to treat him like that. He's already in enough pain." Dalton turned to her, and his gaze grew even colder. "A child? He's not a child. It starts with people like him. Today he's sitting here pretending to be hurt. Tomorrow he'll rob someone or something. I'm just doing my job, lady." The words were like a slap, and Jaden felt everything inside him tearing. He was just a boy who wanted to spend the day with his family. Why did he have to hear this? Why did it have to be with him? "Now get up," Dalton said suddenly, turning to Jaden again. His voice was steely. "I said, get up, or should I help you?" Jaden looked up and met the policeman's gaze. There were no more tears in his eyes, but instead fear mixed with despair. He wanted to answer, but he didn't know what to say. Every word this man said cut him to the core, and he felt like he was losing a piece of himself with every passing moment. "Did you hear me, boy?" Dalton stepped forward, shifting his eyebrows menacingly. The crowd held its breath. The whole world seemed to freeze, waiting to see what would happen next. Dalton froze, looking at Jaden, then shifted his gaze to the crutches lying next to his chair. The corners of his mouth quivered slightly, as if he'd just thought of something particularly mean. His heavy boot came down slowly on one of the crutches, as if testing its strength. The crowd stayed still, each watching the scene as if it were an accident in slow motion, knowing that something terrible was about to happen. "So, this is your prop, then?" Dalton stretched out with a lazy sneer, lifting the crutch with the toe of his boot. "I wonder what you'd do if I took this away from you. Would you be able to stand up? Or would you start whining again?" His voice, filled with sarcastic contempt, echoed over the clearing. "Please, don't hurt them." Jaden raised his head, his voice quiet but trembling with fear. There was a desperation in those words that was impossible not to hear. It wasn't just a request, it was a plea. But the pleading only spurred Dalton on. He bent down and grabbed the crutches, lifting them into the air like a hunter showing off a trophy. "These things make you weak," he said, addressing Jaden, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "That's what's wrong with you. You're always looking for something to lean on instead of standing on your own 2 feet. Oh, wait. You have one of them broken, right?" The crowd gasped. Someone in the back rows exhaled loudly and sharply. People whispered. Some lowered their heads, unable to look at what was happening, but no one moved. They were paralyzed by fear, by powerlessness, by confusion. Only Jaden's mother screamed, "Give him his crutches back!" "What are you doing? He's a child." Dalton turned slowly toward her, his face turning into an icy mask. "The baby? Him? You're too soft on him, lady. Maybe if you taught him responsibility, I wouldn't have to do this." His words were like a lash, but he didn't stop. He turned back to Jaden, still clutching the crutches in his hands. "All right, kid, show us what you can do. Get up, or are you useless without these things?" Jaden tried to say something, but the lump in his throat blocked his breath. His heart was beating so fast he couldn't concentrate. He felt tears start to come to his eyes, but he tried desperately to hold them back. He didn't want to cry in front of this man. He didn't want to give him this victory. But it didn't last long. With a sudden jerk, Dalton threw the crutches to the ground behind his back, beyond Jaden's reach. "Come on, boy. Show everyone what you can do," he said with fake enthusiasm, taking a step back to give Jaden a chance. The teenager tried to rise, leaning on his healthy leg, but the pain was too great, and he collapsed back to the ground. The moment seemed endless. The sound of his fall, the groans of pain, the horror in his mother's and father's eyes. The crowd around him seemed frozen, shocked faces reflecting the horror of the situation. "Look, there they are," Dalton pronounced, addressing the crowd. "This is what happens when you're too weak. You can't even stand up. You count on everyone but yourself." His voice was filled with cold triumph, as if he had just won a battle. Jaden was lying on the ground, his hands shaking, trying to at least sit up. His face was contorted with pain, not just physical pain, but emotional pain. He felt broken, humiliated in front of everyone. His eyes filled with tears, and he hated himself for it. But there was nothing he could do. He was a child that a grown man had decided to destroy in front of everyone. "Give him back his crutches!" The mother screamed again, her voice shaking with anger and tears. "You've already shown your power, but you broke my son. How can you do that?" Dalton only shrugged. "Maybe this will do him good." "Lesson learned," he replied coldly, turning away from the woman as if her words were nothing more than noise. A loud, deep voice came from the background. It was Jaden's father. His calm was finally gone, replaced by an anger he could no longer contain. He slowly took a step forward, his eyes burning like embers. "You've done enough. Get his crutches back now," he said quietly, but there was such a warning in his voice that even Dalton froze for a moment. But this moment wasn't the end. Jaden, lying on the ground, was trembling, tears streaming down his cheeks. In that moment, all who watched felt one thing: how an innocent life had been broken under the weight of injustice. "Please, leave him alone. It's just a baby." The mother's voice broke the silence, her words sounding like a broken cry. She rushed to Jaden, falling to her knees beside her son and wrapped her arms around him, trying to protect him from the humiliation that was crashing over him in a wave. Her hands shook as she ran her fingers over his face, trying to wipe away the tears. "He hasn't done anything. You've already hurt him. Leave him alone." But the policeman Dalton only grinned, as if he enjoyed watching this scenario. There was not an ounce of sympathy in his eyes, only contempt and barely concealed pleasure. "Madam, remove your hands before I arrest you for obstruction of justice," he said, and his voice sounded like the stroke of a whip. The crowd around them began to move. Someone whispered, "This is too much. Something must be done." Others, on the contrary, stepped back, too frightened to intervene. Every second seemed like an hour, and the air around them was so thick it seemed impossible to breathe. "What justice?" screamed the mother, turning her weeping face toward Dalton. Her voice trailed off into a scream filled with pain and despair. "You're just enjoying this. What has he done to you? Why are you treating him like this?" Dalton leaned closer to her, his face turning icy and his voice a venomous whisper that everyone could hear. "Because I know people like him. You're all the same, shedding tears, making yourselves out to be victims, and then wondering why you're not respected. Maybe, if you raised him right, I wouldn't have to teach him myself." He stepped with his boot on the ground beside Jaden, as if to emphasize his superiority. Jaden closed his eyes, wanting only one thing: for it to stop. He could hear his mother sobbing, feel her clutching him as if it would protect him from this nightmare. But he knew her strength wasn't enough. "Get away from my son," the father bellowed, stepping forward, his voice filling the whole place with thunder. People turned to him, their faces a mixture of hope and fear. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. But Dalton, instead of backing away, stood right in front of his father. He wasn't afraid. The same contempt burned in his eyes as before. "And what are you going to do? You think you can yell at me and I'll walk right away?" he said, crossing his arms. "Look, I'm here doing my job, and your son is just another freeloader who thinks he can give a damn about order." "You don't even know him," the mother screamed, her voice breaking with tears. She could barely stand, but her anger, her pain, pushed her forward. "You see only his skin color, and you think you can humiliate him. Shame on you." "Shame?" Dalton grinned. "I'm ashamed that you let something like that grow up. Shame on you for continuing to make him a victim. Maybe if you worked instead of complaining, he'd be human." Those words were the last straw. The crowd began to whisper louder, and someone took a step forward, but stopped, as if struggling with himself. Jaden, still sitting on the ground, looked up at his mother, then at his father. His eyes were filled with tears, but with them came the question, why? Why is this happening to him? His father's gaze grew steely, and he raised his hand to point at the policeman. "You crossed the line," he said quietly, but there was a power in his voice that made even Dalton freeze for a moment. "You forgot that you're a human being, not a machine to break other people. I won't let you destroy my son." But Dalton wasn't going to back down. He took a slow step backward, his hand sliding to his belt where the baton hung. "So, you're going to threaten me? You're the one who's crossing the line now. Do you really want me to show you what happens when you break the law?" His words were as cold as ice, and their weight loomed over the crowd, causing everyone to freeze. Jaden felt his mother's arm wrap around him tighter. Her tears fell on his hair, and in that moment he realized that she was afraid not only for him, but for everyone standing here. No one was safe around this man. At that moment, the crowd, torn between fear and justice, stood on edge. Even the air seemed to stop moving, waiting to see who would make the first move, who would break this deadly silence. The crowd still stood motionless, as if chained in icy chains of fear. Everyone was waiting to see what would happen next, when suddenly a man emerged from the back rows. His steps were slow but sure, and his every movement was full of inner strength. At first glance, he looked unremarkable. Tall, wearing a simple shirt and dark pants, a reserved expression on his face. But as soon as he approached, people instinctively parted, as if sensing that there was something more behind his outward calm. It was Jaden's father. His gaze, directed at the policeman, was not fierce, but cold, almost frighteningly focused. He was not in a hurry, and that anticipation only added to the tension that already covered the clearing like a thick fog. Dalton sensed that look, but instead of backing away, he smirked. It seemed to him that this was just another person who was about to try to talk to him as a representative of the law. He was getting ready to hear the familiar pleas and excuses. The man walked over to his son, crouched beside him, and gently lifted him up, helping him to sit more comfortably. His hands, strong and secure, held Jaden as if he were a precious vessel that couldn't be damaged further. He ran his hand through the boy's hair, and his voice was quiet but clear. "It's all right, son. This will all be over soon." Jaden looked up at his father, his eyes filled with pain and tears. "Dad, I tried," he began, but the man shook his head, stopping him. "It's not your fault, son," he said firmly. There was not only encouragement in those words, but a promise that justice would be served, no matter how long the journey. Jaden's father had straightened up and was now standing in front of the policeman, who squinted at him, not hiding his irritation. "And who are you to interfere? Another one who thinks he can boss me around?" Dalton asked, raising an eyebrow. His hand still rested on the baton, like a threat that could be activated at any moment. The man looked at him directly, and his voice sounded unexpectedly calm. "I'm a father. And this is my son you just humiliated in front of everyone. That's reason enough to intervene." Dalton grinned, but there was no real confidence in his grin. "So what? Your son is another one of those who will never learn to be responsible for his actions. You think your pretty words are going to change anything? I'm here to keep order, and people like you only disrupt it." The crowd gasped, and the whispers grew louder. But Jaden's father didn't take his eyes away. "People like us," he repeated slowly, and there was menace in his voice, though hidden. "You don't even realize who you're talking to, do you?" Dalton straightened up, trying to maintain control of the situation. "Oh, really? And who do you think you are? A judge? A lawyer? Or maybe you think your connections mean something here?" The man crossed his arms over his chest, his gaze even harder. "You're right. I'm a lawyer. One of the best. I've represented families that have suffered from the likes of you and won cases against the likes of you. You have no idea how much I can change things." Dalton's gaze flickered, but he quickly pulled himself together. "I mean, I don't care if you're the president. You're here now, and your son just resisted a representative of the law. So do me a favor and step aside before I add you to my report." The man stepped closer, minimizing the distance between them. He spoke softly, but his voice cut like a knife. "A report? You think your report will make a difference when you're in the dock? I saw how you stripped my son of his crutches, how you humiliated him in front of everyone. I have witnesses. I have records. You're not just going to lose your badge. I'm going to make sure you can never work in this country again. You'll beg for it to be forgotten, but I won't let it." Dalton froze. His face turned pale, and for a second he lost all his look of confidence. His fingers slipped from the baton, and he took a step back. "Are you scaring me or something?" He tried to grin, but his voice sounded less firm. "I'm not scaring you. I'm warning you," the man replied. "This is the last time you allow yourself to do that. Now, give my son back his crutches, apologize to him, and leave. Or I'll make sure you can never even wear that uniform again." The crowd, which had been silent until then, began to whisper louder. They looked at Jaden's father with renewed hope, as if they saw him as a hero who could protect them all. And Jaden, sitting on the ground, felt, for the first time in a while, that he was no longer alone. Before we go any further, let's take one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Has something similar happened in your life or in the lives of your loved ones? Your thoughts and experiences are very important to us, and if you like our stories, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes. And now, we continue. A silence filled with heaviness hung over the clearing. Dalton stood motionless, his hand still not far from the baton. He stared at Father Jaden, trying to keep a mask of confidence on his face, but his eyes betrayed an inner restlessness. The crowd held their breath as they watched the situation slowly but inevitably escalate beyond the usual confrontation. Jaden's mother was still standing next to her son, her arms wrapped tightly around his shoulders as if she could protect him with her presence. Jaden, sitting on the ground, felt broken, but his father's look of determination gave him a tiny glimmer of hope. "You don't seem to understand who I am," Jaden's father said, his voice low and dangerously flat. There was a restrained fury in every word. "I'm not someone who can be intimidated with a badge or a baton. You think you can humiliate my son, my family, and get away with it? You think this is going to stay between us?" Dalton grinned, though it was more like a nervous twitching of his lips. "What? Are you going to teach me? Look, you can be whatever you want, but I'm the law around here. I establish order, and your son and people like him are just a nuisance to normal life." His words sounded harsh, almost deliberate, as if he was trying to convince not only those around him, but also himself that he was right. The crowd stirred. People began to whisper louder, and indignation flashed in the eyes of some. Even the most silent witnesses could no longer remain indifferent. They saw Dalton trapping himself, and they realized that this was the moment of truth. "You talk about the law," Jaden's father continued, his voice still cold and collected. "But what did you do here, today, that is in accordance with the law? Take Crutches away from a child? Threaten my family? Is that what you call order? Or is your order the humiliation of people just because they don't look like you?" Dalton stepped closer, his face hard. He tried to maintain control of the situation, but his confidence was slowly eroding under the pressure. "You don't know what I've seen, who I've dealt with. People like you always play the victim, but I know how it ends. Are you going to scare me now? The trial? With your lawyer talk?" "No," Jaden's father said, his voice getting firmer. "I'm not going to scare you. I'm just going to do my job. When I'm done, you won't be able to wear that uniform again. You'll never raise a hand against someone else's family again. Your actions today aren't just disorderly conduct. It's an abuse of power. It's racist. It is a crime for which you will be held accountable." His father's words, spoken with absolute certainty, were like a cold shower. Dalton froze, and his face twitched slightly. He looked around and noticed how the crowd began to move closer, how people's faces became more and more stern. Now he was no longer the center of attention that he could control. Everything had changed. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he muttered, but you could still see the attempt to save face in his voice. "Just teach your son to respect order, and that'll be the end of it." "No, it doesn't end here," Jaden's father replied sharply, taking a step forward. There were only a few inches between them now. "My son respects the law, but not people like you. The law protects him, and you broke every line, every limit of what is allowed. You wanted to break him in front of his family, in front of his whole community, in front of his friends. But you didn't break him, and you won't break us." Dalton took a step back, and for the first time something like fear flashed in his eyes, but he tried to hide it under a mask of arrogance. "Oh, you're just a smart-ass who thinks he can threaten me," he gritted through gritted teeth. "You don't know who you're messing with. It's my job to keep people like you under control." Jaden's father clenched his fists but held back. His voice was firm but calm. "I know who you're messing with. You're a man who has forgotten what honor and dignity means. You think a badge gives you the right to humiliate people, but that badge won't save you. Are you talking about control? You'll soon find out what real control is when I sue you, when you're subpoenaed, when your actions are broadcast on every screen." The crowd began to whisper louder. Some started filming on their phones, and Dalton noticed it. His face turned pale. He looked around, trying to figure out what to do next. The situation he had controlled with ease a moment ago was now out of his grasp. "You think you won?" he threw, his voice hoarse, but he was no longer looking Jaden's father in the eye. "This isn't over. You're going to regret getting in my way." "No, you're the one who will regret it," the man replied firmly, "and not just for what you did today. You'll regret for every person you humiliated, for every family you broke, for every child you robbed of hope, and I will make sure you can never do it again." With those words, he bent down, picked up Jaden's crutches, and handed them back to his son. His movements were determined and defensive, and when he straightened, his gaze made it clear to Dalton that the game was over. Jaden's father straightened, his suit slightly wrinkled from the tension of the past few minutes, but his face as hard as a stone sculpture. He held the crutches in his hand, like a symbol of the struggle that now belonged not only to his son, but to all those who had ever faced similar humiliation. The crowd around him was no longer silent. The whispers turned to murmurs, and the phone cameras kept filming. Everyone waited to see what would happen next. But what no one expected was that my father would start talking not about the present, but about the past, his past, which he always tried to keep to himself. "You think I don't know how this happens?" he began, looking straight into Dalton's eyes. His voice was firm but restrained, as if a volcano was bubbling inside him, ready to erupt. "You think you're the first? You think I haven't seen this before?" He shifted his gaze to the crowd, his voice louder for all to hear. "But I have seen it. Seen how men in uniform, men like you, abuse their power. Seen you think you're judge, jury, and executioner all at the same time." Dalton frowned, his confidence beginning to fade again, as if it were being washed away by an invisible wave. But Jaden's father went on, and his words began to sound like the taps of a bell, each one echoing in the hearts of the crowd. "When I was the same age as my son, I too stood in front of a police officer. But I wasn't sitting there with crutches. I was lying face down in the dirt because they decided I couldn't afford the bike I was riding. They didn't ask me a single question. They just dragged me out of the car, knocked me down, and left me lying under their boots. And you know what happened next? Nothing. No apologies, no truth, no justice. Just fear, just hate. Only the realization that no matter how hard I tried, I would always be a criminal to them." He was silent for a moment, letting people comprehend what he had said before continuing. "When I got older, I thought I could put it behind me, that it was a one-time thing. But then I saw it happen to my friends, to my brothers, to my neighbors, always the same story. They came to show their power, to make us feel small, insignificant, helpless, and you know why? Because they knew the system would protect them, the same system you're imagining now. The crowd was boiling, and people began to nod, cheering him on. The anger that had been hidden in their hearts was now coming out in his words. Jaden's mother hugged her son, her shoulders still shaking with sobs, but she looked at her husband with pride. It was a moment she dreaded, but knew it would come sooner or later. "You speak of order," the father continued, turning again to Dalton, "but your order is chaos to men like my son. It's the fear you drive into the hearts of children, making them think they'll never be good enough to just live their lives. You think you're the authority here? Number. You're just another tool in a machine that's been broken for a long time." Dalton gritted his teeth, his face pale, but he was still trying to hold himself together. "You're being over-dramatic. The law is the law, and if you think you or your son are above it, you're sorely mistaken." But his father did not let him finish. He raised his hand, interrupting him abruptly. "My son is not above the law, but the law you represent is not the law. It is bullying. It is legalized cruelty. It is an abuse of the power you were given not to humiliate children, but to protect them." Jaden looked up at his father. He saw the pain, the fear, and the hope in his gaze at the same time. He saw his father protecting him, standing in front of this man who had just tried to destroy everything Jaden loved about himself. And for the first time that day, he felt that maybe he wasn't as weak as he'd thought. "You took my son's crutches away from him today," the father said, his voice even louder. "But you did more than just take away his ability to stand up. You tried to take away his dignity. You tried to make him believe he was a nobody. But I'm here to remind you that he is somebody. He's my son. He's a human being, and you will answer for every second of that humiliation." The crowd, which had been whispering before, now boomed. People clapped in support. Someone shouted, "Tell him!" Even those who had been silent at first began to move closer, forming a ring around the policeman and Jaden's father. Dalton took a step back, his face now an ashy gray. He could see the situation spinning out of his control, but Jaden's father wasn't done. "You can't hide behind your badge anymore," he said, his voice becoming almost threatening. "Your actions today are a crime, and I will make sure you never hurt another child again. I will make sure that every knows your name, so that everyone can see your face, so that everyone knows that you are a symbol of what should not exist in our country." With these words, he turned to his son, lifted him to his feet, and, looking into Dalton's eyes, said, "Now go. Go away before you get any worse." And at that moment, even Dalton realized that the game was over for him. The sun, which had shone so carelessly over the clearing earlier in the day, now seemed dim, as if it had retreated before the tension in the air. Dalton stood motionless, his hands still clutching his belt, but now trembling treacherously. The crowd around him grew denser, its whispers turning into an ominous hum. The phone cameras continued to record, and despite his attempts to keep his composure, Dalton's eyes flickered with panic. Jaden's father straightened to his full height, his figure even taller and more imposing than it had been a moment ago. He glanced briefly at his son, who now stood leaning on his crutches. Jaden looked down, his face pale, but his gaze hardened. He sensed that this wasn't just his moment of humiliation, but something much more. And his father, with his confident words and determination, had become to him a symbol of resistance to all this horror. "Do you think it will end here?" Father said, turning to Dalton again, His voice was low and harsh, like the blow of a whip. "You thought you could come here, humiliate my son, my family, and no one would know about it? You're used to acting in the shadows, used to your actions going without consequence. But this is the end. This is the end for you." Dalton tried to grin, but there was no confidence on his face. "You're exaggerating. You can say whatever you want, but I know my rights. And you know what? You're the one who's going to regret going against the law like that." But his voice no longer sounded so confident. He could feel the crowd around him turning more and more into a court of law, his actions into evidence against him. People with phones were filming every gesture he made, every word he said, every look he threw at Jaden and his father. Jaden's father pulled a cell phone out of his pocket. He held it up so everyone could see and pressed a few buttons. "You want to know what real power means?" he asked, not taking his eyes off Dalton. "You had the right to choose. You could have walked away. You could have admitted your mistake, but you chose to continue. Now your actions will be judged by those who know what justice is." He pressed the call button, and after a second his voice grew even louder. "This is Christopher Maxwell. Put me through to the Police Internal Security Division and get a human rights team ready. We have a situation here that you will want to see. There is video footage and witnesses. This should not go unheeded." Dalton turned pale. His face, so confident a moment ago, now resembled a mask of fear. He looked around, his eyes roving over the crowd like a trapped animal. People looked at him with contempt and anger, and he realized that no one believed in his words about order and law anymore. "Look, this is a misunderstanding," he began, taking a step back. "I was just doing my job. You know how it is. Sometimes you have to be tough." "Hard?" Jaden's father interjected, his voice even firmer. "You called humiliating a child doing a job? You took away his crutches. You humiliated him in front of his family. You did it knowing no one would dare stop you. That's not toughness. That's cowardice. And now you're going to answer for every second of it." The crowd began to rise. People shouted words of encouragement. Someone shouted, "We've seen it all. We will be witnesses." Jaden's mother looked up, her face still tear-stained, but determination now burned in her eyes. She stood beside her husband, her hand on her son's shoulder, as if to strengthen their family bond. Dalton took another step back, but his path was blocked. 2 police cars, summoned through Jaden's father's contact, pulled up to the edge of the clearing. The doors opened and uniformed men stepped out of them, but they weren't like Dalton. They were internal affairs, the ones who investigated misconduct among the police themselves. "Officer Dalton," uttered one of them, a tall man with a hard stare. "We have a statement about your actions. You'll have to come with us for an explanation." "This is some kind of misunderstanding," Dalton shouted, his voice trailing off. He looked at the crowd, who were now looking at him with contempt. His hands trembled as he tried to justify himself. "I was just trying to restore order. It was all turned against me." But no one listened to his words anymore. One of the officers approached him, took his baton and radio from him, and then told him to surrender his weapon. This moment, when the badge on his uniform no longer inspired fear, was a real humiliation for him. He felt the weight of condemnation, not only from the crowd but also from his colleagues. Jaden's father looked at this with cold calmness. He took his son by the shoulder, pulled him close to him, and said quietly, "This is for you, son. Just so you know that no one has the right to humiliate you. No one." The crowd broke into applause as Dalton was put into a car and driven away. It was a moment they would remember, the moment when the truth had won. But for Jaden, it wasn't just a moment of justice. It was a reminder that he is more than what this man tried to instill in him, and his family is his strength that will always be there for him. Evening had fallen on the neighborhood, but the light of spotlights and cameras illuminated the clearing as if the day was still going on. The video of the incident had already begun to circulate on the internet, and every hour more people flocked to the scene, journalists, activists, passers-by, wanting to see for themselves what the whole country was now talking about. For Jaden and his family, it was a strange, almost surreal moment. Their tragedy, their pain, suddenly public, something that was being debated and talked about by people who didn't even know their names. Jaden sat on a bench nearby, his mother hugging him tightly, not letting go for a moment. Her eyes were still red with tears, and her hands trembled as she stroked her son's hair. He didn't say anything. It was hard for him to find the words. He felt devastated, broken after everything that had happened. His mind reeled with fragments of phrases Dalton had said, "People like you, incapable, lazy." The words stung like a stigma, and even though his father had spoken in his defense, Jaden still felt the weight of the humiliation that couldn't be erased. His father stood beside them. Christopher Maxwell, normally reserved and calm, now looked as if he had borne the weight of the world on his shoulders. His gaze was directed somewhere far away, but his thoughts were clearly here with his family. He had already made a few calls to his colleagues, organized lawyers, written the first statements, but deep down, he realized that the struggle had only just begun. "We'll get through this, son," he said quietly, not looking at Jaden, but as if he could feel his pain. "This isn't the end. This is the beginning. You'll see that it won't go without consequences, I promise you." Jaden nodded, but didn't say anything. Fear and resentment were still fighting inside him, and he wasn't sure if he would ever feel safe again. The glade that had just been a place of violence and humiliation now seemed hostile to him, even though the people surrounding them were expressing support. Meanwhile, the crowd around them did not disperse. People gathered in groups discussing what had happened. Some held signs that had been hastily written, "Justice for Jaden," and "The system needs to change." The incident seemed to be the catalyst that awakened what had long been hidden behind a veil of silence. People shared their stories of how they themselves or their children had experienced injustice, racism, violence at the hands of those who are supposed to protect. One woman came up to Christopher and, placing her hand on his shoulder, said quietly, "Thank you for not being silent. For what you have done, you have inspired us." Her words were simple, but there was so much sincerity in them that Christopher allowed himself to relax a little for the first time all evening. But even amidst this support, there was anxiety. Everyone knew this wasn't over. Firing one police officer or arresting him would not solve the problem. It was just the tip of the iceberg. The system that spawned Dalton was deeper, more complex, and more dangerous. People realized there was a long road ahead, but as they watched the crowd come together, as strangers supported each other, there was hope in their hearts. Jaden, sitting next to him, saw it all. He could hear people talking about him, his name coming out of strangers' mouths. It was strange to him to realize that his humiliation had become a symbol for so many. It was hard, almost unbearable. But when one little girl, walking up with her mother, handed him a card that read, "You are strong," he smiled for the first time in a day. Her gesture, her words, simple and sincere, showed him that he was not alone. Christopher stood back, looking at it all, his heart breaking with contradiction. He was proud of his family, of his son, who had made it through this terrible day. But he knew that the road to true justice was just beginning. Could one family, one community change an entire system? He didn't know the answer, but he did know one thing. They must try. Later, as the crowd began to disperse and only those closest to them remained in the clearing, Christopher turned to Jaden and said, "We have survived this day, but I want you to know that your future will not be determined by what this man said. He is just a reflection of a system that is afraid of change. And you are the change. You are an example of something worth fighting for." Jaden looked up at his father. His face still reflected pain and weariness, but deep down his gaze had hardened. He nodded. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew his family would be there for him. And maybe that was enough to start him on the road to healing. The story of Jaden and his family did not end there. It became part of something bigger, a movement for change that could not be stopped. But even in this glimmer of hope, the question remained: would the system change, or would it stay the way it was? No one knew the answer, but Christopher, holding his son by the shoulder, was certain. They had taken the first step, and sometimes that's enough for the world to begin to change. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism or injustice in your life? We want to know what you think, because each of you is incredibly valuable to us. If you listened until the end, write the phrase, "Justice must be done." Don't forget to subscribe and give us a like to support us. We wish you a good day